I'm going to have a quick and short talk about scaling your API workflow. And just to make it all kind of scalable, I've scaled all the letters up so that you get what I mean. Just scaling it big when you have a lot of APIs. Quick intro. My name is Jakub Nesetril. I run a company and founded a company called Apiary. Just out of interest, anybody in the audience that knows Apiary? Woohoo! You're awesome. Fantastic. Anybody that pays for Apiary? Oh, okay. I had to try it. My colleague, Emmanuel, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, also runs API Craft San Francisco. So if you're into APIs, feel free to come as well. Quick plug for the API meetup. We had an IoT-focused one in February, an API design hackathon in March. I think April we went silent a little bit, but June I think they're preparing something again, so feel free to go to meetup.com and figure out more. So I'll do a very quick intro about Apiary, but mostly I will tell you why I actually am going to be talking about scaling API design. And it's going to be really short, and then we're just going to get to the meat of it. So Apiary is a platform for API design and collaboration for REST APIs. That's important to note, especially in this audience, where a lot of the microservice installations are not about REST APIs. But if you do use HTTP-based kind of REST-style APIs, then Apiary is a really cool platform for you. Most of the tools out there that you will find focus on the runtime part. You know, once your API is done and finished, how to monitor it, how to test it, how to deploy it, etc. We focus on the part from having an idea to getting an API done. We think that's also pretty important, and not enough people are looking at that problem. I have a little bit of a slight aesthetic problem on this slide, but you'll pardon me on that. We've got over 200,000 APIs that are being built using Apiary, 180,000 developers, so it's a pretty big platform, tons and tons of API developers using the APIs that are being designed using Apiary. When you're thinking about what we're doing, you can kind of imagine an integration into GitHub, integration into continuous integration, support for prototyping, documentation, and design, and a larger scale governance across the company, and all of that kind of rolled into one seamless platform. If you're a fan of the API description languages, then we support Swagger, API Blueprint, and Open API specification, and across all these three formats, you can have that platform that enables you all of the features above. So that's just a little quick intro for bragging rights, so that you know why I'm talking about scaling API design. We've got tons of developers building APIs. We've got lots of customers that we're looking at, and we're kind of trying to distill some understanding of what problems they're going through and what are the best ways to avoid those pitfalls. And so that's kind of what I tried to do today. So first, a couple quick comments. Most APIs out there actually aren't public. Like when you think about an API, typically people think about this like big one, large Twitter API or Twilio, you know, business model based around an API. That's the little tips of the iceberg. But for most of us here in the audience, I would guess, and for most people that are building software, APIs is usually something that you use internally within the company, and especially in microservices, you know, you just use this as an architecture strategy rather than something that is out there in the public. And so a lot of the kind of API knowledge and API lessons that you learn from people are really focused at this kind of big one public API that you're doing for millions of developers. But that's a very different strategy to having tons of APIs internally within your company. And so that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. I kind of hesitate to say that it's microservices because nobody really knows what the hell microservices are. It's kind of a fluid definition, a little bit like REST API. Nobody knows what that is either. So I'm fine with that. It's flexible. That's OK. But mostly I'm going to be focusing on lots and lots of internal APIs. Let's call it that way, right? And you know what exactly that is, and if it's microservices or not, I'll leave up to you. So what we're seeing is, and you know I've already alluded to it, it's all like fun and games and pretty simple to follow best practices and knock out a really awesome API and have all the agile and continuous integration set up if you have one single API. But if you have 100, or if you have 1,000, or if you have a couple thousand, then the game changes significantly. And you have to follow rules that are slightly different from when you really have weeks and months to design your one beautiful garden of API that you open up to the world. So I tried to do 5 simple rules. That's what I promised in the title of my talk. 5 simple rules that we've kind of distilled from the market, that we've distilled from all of the customers that are using Apiary, and we've distilled from all the interaction with them. And I think they're a little bit counterintuitive, and hopefully at least some of them controversial. So feel free to shout yay or shout nay, or just like throw something at me, or ask questions. Actually, that's probably the most important part. So don't wait until the end. Happy to field questions during the talk. So first of all, counterintuitive, absolutely necessary, you have to standardize. You know, for most of us, I assume in this audience are from smaller companies. You know, top-down standardization isn't really something that we're really hot on. You know, it's kind of throwing it out there and trying to iterate around it sounds like a good idea. If you have thousands of APIs, it will stop sounding like a good idea. I can guarantee that, and we have tons of customers who have kind of run into that. So what are the things that you're kind of thinking about standardizing within the company? Because sometimes, you know, that might not necessarily be intuitive either. And I kind of break it into 3 different components. I think the most important one, and at the same time the least intuitive one, is you have to standardize the process. You have to standardize the way that you build APIs in your company. And that can be something as simple as saying, well, we just do everything with GitHub, and you know, our deployment strategy is continuous deployment when we merge into this branch, and only these people can merge. But then once you start kind of thinking about it a little bit deeper, you start thinking about who gets to decide that we need a new API, how do we design that API, who gets to approve that if we need some kind of approval, or does everybody just create an API if they want to create one. What does the deployment process look like? All of that kind of needs to be standard, because if everybody's doing something different, then it becomes very difficult to manage all of those hundreds of thousands within a reasonable amount of effort. The second one that will probably be more intuitive is standardizing on the protocol, because if you don't have standard APIs across the protocol, then it becomes really difficult to interoperate between the different parts of the company. That's probably quite intuitive. What's also less intuitive is that sometimes that's not just really like the kind of line level protocol of whether you're using HTTP, or whether you're using REST, whether you're using gRPC, but it can also really go down deeper into the semantics of how do I name things, how do I, what types of data I'm using, what types of data objects. And just to give you one very, very practical example that is so simple that even the journalists get it when I try to explain what Apiary does. We have one of our customers is an accounting software company from New Zealand, a couple hundred developers building tons of internal microservices. They have had very much that kind of hooray model of let's just build it and everybody does their own, and we'll just organically grow there. And a couple years into that, they have kind of somehow organically realized that. And actually, I think the gentleman from Nesetril had a very nice slide about how the architecture of the microservice structure typically copies the organizational structure of the company. And I think that's a good observation. And they've realized that half of their API surface is spelled in American English and the other half is spelled in British English, because half of their engineering team is in New Zealand and the other half is in San Francisco, right? And that kind of sounds like a really stupid, silly thing. Well, why don't you just run it through a spell checker, until you realize all the consequences of having to rewrite all of your code and all of the dependencies and all of the data structures and all of the navigation where you're going to, until you realize that huge cost of kind of, that you're dragging along with you when every time when you switch from one part of your application to another part, you have to start like respelling all of your JSON keys in your data structures because, they're spelled slightly with a Z versus with a S over here and over there. It's just incredibly annoying, right? So it sounds silly at the start, but standardizing is really important, because if you have one API, you can deal with these things manually. If you have 100 APIs, less so. If you have thousands, then it just becomes unmanageable. So that's rule number 1. So far, no bottles thrown at me? All right. Rule number 2, automate. If you have standardization, the second thing that you need to do is automate. We've seen that also many, many times. So the next step after you've realized that half of your surface is in British English and the other half in American English, is that you make a decree that says everything shall be in British English, which they happen to do. And that's really nice, and you circulate it in your PDF document on page 54, and you send it to your whole engineering team, and everybody forgets about it the next week, right? So until you actually are able to automate a lot of this stuff, you can't reach that scale of API development that you often need when you have pervasive API usage across your architecture. So it's all about kind of being able to build all of these APIs with speed, so that you don't have that huge amount of manual overhead that you can afford with one single API, but you can't afford it with many. And you really kind of, some of the things that I put out there are the things that you might not be thinking about with regards to automation. Maybe you're thinking, yeah, I want to have CI/CD, I want to automate my testing, I want to automate my deployment. Maybe some of you are thinking about automating monitoring, like again, the example from Netflix, Nesetril, I think was a really nice one. But you also want to automate things like upstream changes in your API that might potentially be impacting other dependencies within your company, so that when people are about to break your code, you kind of find out about it sooner than when it's in production. And if you have a standardized way to build these APIs, you can really automate these things with a great degree of precision. On top of several of the API description formats, you can also automate the compliance. So you can really write rules that sometimes say, we want to have at least one documented error code for every API endpoint. We want to have a status health check for every resource that we have so that we know that it's still up. These kinds of things are more obvious. Sometimes you even write rules like, I want to make sure that all the JSON keys are spelled with British English. And these can then be automatically evaluated as part of your continuous integration and continuous delivery process. So automating is another really important part of scaling the API design and API development workflow. All good? Okay. Lesson number 3. That's getting more controversial. Version, at least, originally it was with a dash, versionless, but then I kind of put it into quotes a little bit to give you a little bit more wiggle room. In all the API examples that I've reviewed and that we've seen through conversations with our customers, API versioning is a way how to communicate upcoming changes. And it's been invented because downstream customers that are using your public API when you're Twitter have a huge momentum, and they, A, drag you along very strongly, and B, they are impossible to force to change and adapt, unless you take the Twitter example and you just send them away. And so that's a strategy that is unfortunately necessary for a public API. But when you're working within one company, when you're working within one command structure, I'm assuming that somewhere this bubbles up all the way to kind of one CTO, one VP of engineering. Even if you have multiple different product teams, you still can really force yourself to try to drive off the latest versions, and if not automatically off the latest versions, then at least kind of version in a way that's kind of inherently temporary, and where everybody understands that we're migrating off to that latest version as quickly as possible. You'll avoid a huge amount of pain and a huge amount of backward maintenance and compatibility if you really inject a culture into your engineering teams where you're migrating everybody off to the latest API version as part of the whole process of unrolling an API. So number 4, embrace. And what I mean by embrace is embrace the consumer that is using your API. And I think this is a very important one that is very rarely honored in actually both the public APIs and the private APIs, but again, in the private APIs, it's a lot simpler. So there is, the number one thing that I get always when I'm talking about API design is people come to me and they say, what is the right way to design an API? And there is no one right way to design an API. It depends on how it's going to be used. And so it's almost like if you don't have a use case, I have this line here, the API is like a Schrodinger's cat. It's kind of half dead, half alive. Nobody knows which way it's going to go until you confront it with a customer or with an API consumer that's going to use it. You can't design an API and say, what do you think about this? And have somebody like review it for you without like thinking through of how it's going to be used, what are the dependencies, who's going to use it, what's the data that's going to go into it, what's the volume, what's the frequency, where's the other server going to live, what's the latency between those two servers, et cetera, et cetera. And for that exactly the same functionality and exactly the same data set, the API might be completely great for one type of use case and completely broken for another type of use case. So front-loading this as much as possible to the point where essentially as part of your design process, as part of your process of developing an API, the first thing you do when you're about to build a new service is you find a customer that's going to use that service within your company, and then you form a team and actually build something together, rather than saying, well, I think this would be kind of good and other people will, I guess, use it or need it, and so I'm going to design it here and do that kind of typical engineering, if you build it, they will come kind of approach. Then you really have that ability within your company to kind of put this as part of your process, that first you find a customer and you design this API together. And I can't stress how important that is. But when I say together, I don't mean like you both get into the room and kind of fantasize about how the API should look like. The API consumer actually has to write a client as part of the like design process. Like it's almost like you should first have somebody try to consume your service before you're even kind of building it. And that's one that I have seen a lot of companies kind of build that whole I have my data here, I have my database here, this is what my data objects look like, this is what I think I want to expose, and 6 months later, when people actually start using this for a use case that they haven't even envisioned, they just have to go back and redesign and usually do a completely new API. The good news is that in the microservice context, it's a lot simpler than relaunching your whole API strategy, but at the same time, because your customer is internal, it's usually a lot simpler to just find somebody and get them over for a beer, or just spin up a joint hangout session together and just kind of talk about how they're going to use it, and then get them to actually participate on the development process with you. So that's a little bit of a coupling on the social level, which makes my fifth point even more counterintuitive, which means decouple. The last point that I'm seeing here, and I was so happy when I saw that in the Nesetril presentation as well, is I see that tendency of people when we talk about automation to try to cram everything onto the language level within the implementation. So essentially, I think it comes all the way back from like the Java days when Java class diagrams were generated out of annotations within the code, and then like introspection into the code and static analysis of the code. And I think that totally defeats the purpose of microservices creating a decoupling within your company where different teams can run with different languages, they can make their own autonomous decisions around what their technical stack looks like. And if you start building your automation and all of these processes that we talked about on a language level, then it really bakes everybody into that same language. It also usually means that, for example, you're marrying your API surface with the implementation that's beneath it. So one of the ways that I explain this to people is basically you should think about your API documentation as a definition of how your surface of that little kind of service works. And that definition essentially, another way for us engineers to think about a definition is a test case. We have a test case that describes how our product works, and then we can go ahead and refactor and change all the code base and re-implement in any language that we want, and we still have the certainty that the product actually works as intended. And in this context, the API documentation is the product definition. The API documentation is kind of your test suite that defines from the outside how it works. And on the inside, you have an implementation that is purposefully decoupled from it, because you would never generate your test suite out of your implementation code. That just completely defeats the purpose. So resisting the urge to couple everything onto the language level, I think is one last thing that I would mention here, because as people kind of drive towards the speed of execution and automating everything, the first thing they do is they say, we'll just kind of automate everything on the language level, and then invariably they'll start fragmenting, and you have the Node.js camp, and you have the Python camp, and you have the Ruby guys, and you have the Java guys, and everybody has a different stack, and everybody has a different automation, and before you know it, you're again back where you didn't want to be, where you're kind of managing 16 different systems within your company, and really failing to do that. So those were my 5 quick points, and I, of course, did not choose those 5 letters in any way, and I did not run them through an online thesaurus to kind of help you create a mnemonic, but 5 rules: standardize, automate, version, embrace, version less, embrace, and decouple. So thank you for attention. All right.